Mount Everest has killed over 300 people since 1953. Some died quickly, avalanches, falls, instant, but others died slowly, consciously, knowing exactly what was happening, freezing to death over hours or days, calling for help that never came, watching other climbers walk past them, leaving them to die, begging, pleading, screaming, and then silence. This is a ranking of the 10 worst deaths in Mount Everest history. Not the most deaths, not the deadliest disasters, but the worst individual deaths, the ones where climbers suffered the most, where they died knowing they were abandoned, where they had time to think about their families, their choices, their regrets, where death wasn't instant, it was prolonged, agonizing, conscious. We're ranking these deaths based on 5 criteria. 1. Suffering. How much physical pain did they endure? 2. Consciousness. Were they aware they were dying? 3. Abandonment. Were they left alone? Did people walk past them? 4. Preventability. Could they have been saved? 5. Emotional impact. What did their deaths do to the people who witnessed them, to their families? Some of these deaths you already know, some you don't, but all of them are horrifying. All of them ask the same uncomfortable question: what's the worst way to die on Mount Everest? And the answer is this: slowly, consciously, alone. Knowing people could save you, but won't. This is that list. 10. Hannelore Schmatz, frozen, sitting up for 17 years. Our number 10 worst death is Hannelore Schmatz, a German climber who froze to death in 1979 and whose body sat visible on the south summit for 17 years. Hannelore was 39 years old, an experienced mountaineer. In October 1979, she became the 4th woman ever to summit Mount Everest. She and her husband summited together. But on the descent, Hannelore collapsed. At 27,600 feet, just 300 meters from Camp 4, from safety, she sat down in the snow and couldn't get up. Her husband and their Sherpa guide tried to help her, but she was exhausted, hypothermic, unable to move. Eventually, they had to make a choice: stay and die with her, or descend. They descended, planning to return with help. But when they came back the next morning, Hannelore was dead, leaning against her backpack. Her eyes were open, staring at the sky, and that's how she stayed. For 17 years, climbers passing by reported seeing her, sitting there, eyes open, hair blowing in the wind. From a distance, she looked alive, like she was just resting. But up close, the truth was horrifying. Her skin was frozen, waxy, pale. Her eyes were glazed over, but still open, and her position, sitting upright, made it look like she was watching climbers pass. Some climbers said they made eye contact with her. They knew she was dead, but it felt like she was looking at them, judging them, asking why they were continuing when she couldn't. One climber said this: "I couldn't look at her. I had to turn away, because it felt like she was asking me why I was still climbing, and I didn't have an answer." In 1996, Hannelore's body disappeared, either blown off the mountain by wind or moved by Sherpas. No one knows. But for 17 years, she sat there, eyes open, watching. Why is this number 10? Because Hannelore died relatively quickly, within hours. She wasn't abandoned by strangers. Her husband tried to save her, and she wasn't conscious for long. Hypothermia shut her brain down. But what makes this death horrific is the aftermath. 17 years of climbers walking past her body, 17 years of her sitting there, eyes open. A permanent reminder of what happens when you can't take one more step. Hannelore Schmatz died in 1979, but her image haunted climbers for nearly 2 decades. And even now, decades after her body disappeared, people still talk about her. The woman who sat on Everest for 17 years, watching, waiting, eyes open. 9. Shreya Shah Chlorfine, died calling her husband. Number 9 is Shreya Shah Chlorfine, a Canadian climber who died in 2012 and whose death was entirely preventable. Shreya was 33 years old, a software engineer. She'd dreamed of climbing Everest for years. In May 2012, she joined a commercial expedition. But Shreya wasn't adequately prepared. She'd never climbed above 6,000 meters before Everest. She lacked experience, fitness, altitude adaptation, but she'd paid for the expedition, and she wanted to summit. On May 19, 2012, Shreya left for the summit. The climb was slow, too slow. Her guide repeatedly told her to turn around. You won't make it. But Shreya refused. She said this, I've come too far. I'm not turning back. She summited around 4:30 p.m., hours past the safe turnaround time, and on the descent, she collapsed at 27,500 feet. Completely exhausted, her guide tried to help her, but Shreya couldn't move. She sat down and refused to stand. The guide radioed base camp, asked for instructions. Base camp told him, you have to leave her. If you stay, you'll die too. The guide left, and Shreya sat there, alone, with her satellite phone. She called her husband in Canada, and she told him what was happening. I can't move. I'm stuck. I'm so tired. Her husband begged her, stand up, just take one step. You can do this. But Shreya couldn't. She was hypothermic, oxygen deprived, shutting down. The call lasted about 20 minutes, and then Shreya's voice faded. Her husband stayed on the line, listening, begging her to respond, but there was only silence. Shreya Shah Chlorfine died on the phone with her husband, while he listened, helpless, 11,000 miles away. Her body remained on the mountain. Why is this number 9? Because Shreya's death was entirely preventable. She ignored her guide, ignored turnaround times, ignored warnings, and she died because of summit fever, the obsession with reaching the top. But what makes this death particularly horrific is the phone call. Her husband had to listen to her die, had to hear her voice fade, her breathing stop, and there was nothing he could do. Shreya's family blamed the expedition company. They said the guide should have forced her to turn around. The company said Shreya signed a waiver. She knew the risks. The debate continues. But Shreya is still on the mountain, and her husband still carries the memory of that phone call, the sound of his wife dying, while he listened, powerless. 8. David Sharp. 40 people walked past him. Number 8 is David Sharp, a British climber who died in 2006 in one of the most controversial deaths in Everest history. Because David didn't die alone. He died while 40 people walked past him. David was 34 years old, experienced, strong, but he was climbing solo, without a guide, without support, and he didn't bring enough oxygen. 2006, David summited Everest, but he summited late, around 6 p.m., and on the descent, he collapsed. He made it to Green Boots Cave, a small alcove at 27,990 feet, and he sat down, unable to continue. The next morning, climbers heading for the summit found David, sitting in the cave, still alive, barely. He was mumbling, incoherent, frostbitten. His hands were frozen black. His face was covered in ice, but he was breathing. The first climber to find him was a Turkish woman, Bursak Pochan. She stopped, tried to help. She gave him oxygen, tried to get him to stand. She spent 20 minutes with him, but David couldn't move. He was too weak, and Bursak had to make a choice, stay and die with him, or continue. She continued. Throughout the day, over 40 climbers passed David Sharp. Some stopped briefly, offered oxygen, tried to talk to him. Others walked past without stopping. By the afternoon, David was still alive, still sitting in the cave. One climber radioed base camp. There's a man dying in Green Boots Cave. What should we do? Base camp's response. There's nothing you can do. If you try to help, you'll die too. So the climbers kept walking. David Sharp died sometime on the night of May 15th after sitting in that cave for over 24 hours, watching dozens of people walk past him, knowing they could help, but wouldn't. His death sparked global outrage. The media called it mountaineering's greatest shame. Headlines read, Climbers let man die for summit glory. Sir Edmund Hillary, the first person to summit Everest, said this: "I think the whole attitude toward climbing Mount Everest has become rather horrifying. People just want to get to the top. They don't give a damn about anybody else who might be in distress." But others defended the climbers. They said rescuing David was impossible. He was too high, too weak. Attempting a rescue would have just added more bodies. Why is David Sharp number 8? Because 40 people walked past him, 40 people saw him dying and kept going. David wasn't abandoned by one person. He was abandoned by dozens, and he sat there for 24 hours, conscious, watching them leave. That's what makes this death so horrifying. Not that he died alone, but that he died surrounded by people who chose not to help. David Sharp's body is still in Green Boots Cave, sitting where he died, a permanent reminder of what happens when summit fever matters more than human life. 7. Yasuko Namba, left for dead twice. Number 7 is Yasuko Namba, a Japanese climber who died in the 1996 disaster and who was left for dead twice. Yasuko was 47 years old. She was attempting to become the oldest woman to complete the 7 summits, climbing the highest peak on every continent. Everest was her final mountain. On May 10, 1996, Yasuko summited successfully. But she got caught in the storm that killed Rob Hall and 7 others. On the descent, Yasuko became separated from her group. She wandered in the whiteout, lost, freezing. Eventually, she collapsed on the South Col at 26,000 feet. The next morning, rescuers found a group of climbers who'd been lost in the storm. Yasuko was among them. She was unconscious, no pulse, frozen solid. The rescuers checked her vital signs. Nothing. They declared her dead, and they covered her with a sleeping bag. But then, hours later, another climber passed by and saw the sleeping bag move. Yasuko was alive, barely, but alive. The climber radioed base camp. "Yasuko's alive. What should we do?" Base camp sent a team to assess her condition. When they arrived, Yasuko was conscious. Her eyes were open. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. But she was aware. She knew what was happening. The rescue team tried to get her to stand, to walk. But Yasuko couldn't. Her legs were frozen, unresponsive. The team spent hours trying to move her. But she was dead weight, and they were at 26,000 feet, exhausted, oxygen deprived. Finally, they made the decision. They couldn't save her, and if they stayed longer, they'd die too, so they left. For the second time, Yasuko Namba was left for dead, but this time she was conscious. She knew they were leaving. She watched them walk away. Yasuko died sometime that night, alone on the South Col, frozen, abandoned. Her body was later buried under rocks near where she died. Why is Yasuko number 7? Because she was left for dead twice. The first time, she was unconscious, unaware. But the second time, she was awake. She saw the rescuers leave. She knew she was being abandoned, and there was nothing she could do. Yasuko Namba was one of the most accomplished female mountaineers of her time. She'd climbed 6 of the 7 summits, and Everest, her final mountain, killed her. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, consciously. While rescuers walked away, Yasuko's family said this: "She died doing what she loved, but we wish she'd loved us more. We wish she'd come home." 6. Doug Hansen. Rob Hall died trying to save him. Number 6 is Doug Hansen. The climber Rob Hall died trying to save in 1996. Doug was 46 years old, a postal worker from Seattle. He'd attempted Everest in 1995 with Rob Hall, but he'd turned back 300 feet from the summit. Rob had enforced the 2 p.m. turnaround rule. Doug was devastated. He'd spent his life savings and failed. So he returned in 1996, took out loans. This was his last chance. On May 10, 1996, Doug summited at 4 p.m., 2 hours past the turnaround time. Rob had broken his own rule because he wanted Doug to succeed. But on the descent, Doug collapsed. He sat down in the snow and couldn't get up. Rob stayed with him, tried to help him move, but Doug was completely spent. He'd pushed beyond his limits to summit, and now he had nothing left. Around midnight, Rob radioed base camp. Doug's in bad shape. I don't think he's going to make it, base camp asked. Can you leave him? Can you descend? Rob's response was immediate. No, I won't leave him. And that decision sealed Rob's fate, because staying with Doug meant Rob couldn't descend either. Doug Hansen died around midnight on May 10th, sitting in the snow at 28,700 feet. With Rob Hall beside him, Rob stayed with Doug's body for hours, and then, alone, he tried to descend, but he couldn't. His hands were frozen, his legs weren't working. Rob Hall died the next day, calling his wife to say goodbye. Why is Doug number 6? Because his death killed 2 people. Doug died knowing his guide had stayed with him, sacrificed his life, and Rob died knowing he'd broken his own rule and paid the price. Doug's family said this. Doug died doing what he loved, but was it worth it? Rob Hall had a pregnant wife, a future, and he died trying to save Doug. Was a summit worth that? We don't think so. Doug Hansen's body remained on Everest for years, eventually buried under snow. His death, and Rob's, became a cautionary tale about summit fever, about breaking your own rules, and about the price of loyalty. 5. Francis Arsentiev begged, "Don't leave me," for hours. Number 5 is Francis Arsentiev, and who died after hours of pleading climbers not to leave Francis was 40 years old, an experienced climber. In May 1998, she and her husband Sergei summited Everest without oxygen. Francis became the first American woman to do so. But on the descent, Francis collapsed at 27,200 feet. Sergei descended to get oxygen, to organize a rescue. He never came back. The next morning, Uzbek climbers found Francis, still alive, lying on a steep slope. And she was begging. She was conscious. Please aware. Don't leave me. The climbers tried to help, spent hours trying to move her, but she was too weak, too heavy, and the slope was too steep. They shared oxygen with her, tried to warm her hands, but Francis couldn't move her legs. They were frozen. After hours of trying, the Uzbek team had to leave. They were running out of oxygen, running out of time. One of them later said this. She looked at us. Her eyes followed us. She knew we were leaving. And she said again, please, please don't leave me. But we had to. If we stayed, we'd die too. Later that day, 2 more climbers found Francis, Ian Woodall and Kathy O'Dowd. Ian stopped, spent an hour with her. He held her hand, talked to her, draped his jacket over her, but eventually he had to leave too. Francis Arsentiev died that night, after spending an entire day begging for help, after watching multiple groups of climbers leave her, after saying, please don't leave me, over and over, until she couldn't speak anymore. Her body stayed on the mountain for 9 years. Climbers called her Sleeping Beauty. Why is Francis number 5? Because she didn't die quickly. She died over the course of a full day. Conscious, aware, begging. She watched people try to help, and then watched them give up. She knew she was being abandoned, and there was nothing she could do. Ian Woodall said this. That image, her eyes following us as we left, haunts me. I see it when I close my eyes. I'll see it for the rest of my life. Francis didn't just die on Everest. She died begging strangers not to leave her, and they left anyway. 4. The 16 Sherpas, buried alive in 90 seconds. Number 4 isn't a single death, it's 16 deaths. The deadliest disaster in Everest climbing history, excluding earthquakes. On April 18, 2014, an avalanche swept through the Khumbu icefall, killing 16 Sherpas in 90 seconds. The Sherpas were working, setting ropes, carrying loads, preparing the route for client expeditions. It was early season, weeks before summit attempts. The Sherpas were doing what they do every season, the most dangerous work on the mountain. Around 6:30 a.m., a massive ice serac collapsed. It triggered an avalanche. Thousands of tons of ice and snow, no time to run. The avalanche buried them in seconds. Rescue teams rushed to the site, started digging. They found bodies, crushed, frozen, buried under meters of ice. Some were still holding ropes, still in climbing position. They died instantly, but not all of them. At least 3 Sherpas were found alive, buried under the snow. Rescuers dug frantically, tried to reach them, but the ice was too deep, too heavy, and the survivors were running out of air. One by one, they suffocated, trapped under the ice, conscious, aware, hearing the rescuers above them, digging, shouting, but unable to reach them in time. By the end of the day, 16 Sherpas were dead. The youngest was 20 years old, the oldest was 37, most had families, children, wives waiting at home. Why is this number 4? Because at least 3 of these men died slowly, buried alive, suffocating under rescuers ice, trying to reach them, but failing. And because these men died doing the most dangerous work on Everest, work that Western clients refused to do, they died so rich people could summit, and they were paid a fraction of what Western guides earn. After the disaster, Sherpas went on strike. They demanded better pay, better insurance, better working conditions. The Nepali government made minor concessions, but the fundamental problem remains. Sherpas die at disproportionate rates, for disproportionately low pay, and the 16 men who died on April 18, 2014 are a reminder that Everest's deadliest work is done by the people who are valued the least. 3. Marko Litenecker fell into a crevasse and agonized for 5 days. Number 3 is Marko Litenecker, a Slovenian climber who died in 2005 in one of the most prolonged, agonizing deaths in Everest history. Marko was 42 years old. On May 21, 2005, Marko was descending from the summit. He was alone, unroped, moving quickly. And then he stepped on a snow bridge, a thin layer of snow covering a deep crevasse. The snow collapsed, and Marko fell. He plunged 70 feet into the crevasse. His fall was broken by ice ledges. He didn't fall all the way to the bottom, but he was trapped, wedged between walls of ice. In complete darkness, 70 feet below the surface, Marko's legs were shattered. His back was broken. He couldn't move, couldn't climb, but he was conscious, and he had his radio. He called for help. Base camp received his call and immediately organized a rescue, but the crevasse was deep, narrow, unstable. Lowering someone down was nearly impossible. The rescue team tried for hours, for days. They lowered ropes, called down to Marko, tried to guide him, but Marko couldn't move. His injuries were too severe, and slowly hypothermia set in. Marko spent 5 days in that crevasse, 5 days in total darkness, in freezing cold, with broken legs, a broken back, no food, no water. He stayed on the radio, talking to rescuers, to his family. His wife said this: "I talked to him every day. He told me he loved me. He told me to take care of our children." And then, on the 5th day, he stopped responding. Marko Litenecker died on May 26, 2005. Alone in a crevasse, his body was never recovered. After 5 days of agony, because he died over 5 days. 5 days of consciousness, pain, fear. 5 days of talking to rescuers who couldn't reach him. 5 days of knowing he was going to die and waiting for it. That's psychological torture, physical torture, and it makes Marko's death one of the worst in Everest history. Not because of how he died, but because of how long it took. Chen Yunan, abandoned by his own team. Number 2 is Chen Yunan, a Taiwanese climber who died in 2017, abandoned by his own expedition team. Chen was 51 years old, an experienced climber from Taiwan. In May 2017, he joined a commercial expedition to Everest. On May 21st, Chen summited successfully, but on the descent, he collapsed at 27,500 feet, exhausted, hypothermic. Chen radioed his team. "I can't move.
Hold on.
I need help." But they didn't come.
His team leader
Chen
radioed
waited
back.
for hours.
"We're coming."
Calling on the radio. "Where are you? Please help me. I'm freezing." His team was descending. Without him, they'd made the decision to leave him. Other climbers passed Chen, saw him lying in the snow. Some stopped, offered oxygen, tried to help. But Chen was too weak, too heavy, and his own team, the people who were supposed to protect him, had abandoned him. Chen Yunnan died on May 22nd, after spending over 12 hours waiting for a rescue that never came. His death sparked outrage in Taiwan. His family sued the expedition company. They said Chen had been abandoned, left to die. The company said there was nothing they could do. Rescue was impossible. But other climbers who were there said this: "His team left him. They didn't even try. They made it down safely, and Chen died alone." Why is Chen number 2? Because he was abandoned by the people who were supposed to save him, not by strangers, by his own team. He waited for them, called for them, begged them to come back. And they didn't. Chen died, knowing his team had left him. That's betrayal. That's abandonment. And that's why his death is one of the worst in Everest history. 1. Scott Fisher died calling for his children. The worst death in Mount Everest history is Scott Fisher. An American climbing 40 years old, one of the most charismatic, experienced guides on Everest. He led Mountain Madness expeditions, guided clients to the summit. And in May 1996, he was leading 8 clients on their summit attempt. Scott had been sick for days, altitude sickness, exhaustion, but he pushed himself because his clients were counting on him. On May 10, 1996, Scott summited successfully, but he was moving slowly, too slowly. On the descent, Scott, at 27,200 feet, on a steep as exposed slope. His teammate Anatoly Bukriva found him. Scott was sitting in the snow, barely conscious. Anatoly tried to help, tried to get Scott to stand, but Scott couldn't. He was too weak. Anatoly had to make a choice: stay with Scott and die, or descend and send help. He descended. Scott Fisher sat on that slope for over 18 hours, alone, freezing, dying. And during those hours, Scott was hallucinating. He thought he was at home, with his children. Other climbers who passed him later said they heard him talking, calling out names: Jenna, Andy, Katie, his children's names. Scott was talking to them. In his mind, they were there. He was saying goodbye. Scott Fisher died on May 11, 1996, alone on a slope, hallucinating, calling for his children. Why is Scott Fisher number 1? Because he died slowly, over 18 hours. Because he died alone. Abandoned. Because he was hallucinating, talking to his children who weren't there. And because Scott Fisher was a hero. He'd saved countless climbers, guided dozens to the summit. He was strong, experienced, loved, and he died in the most heartbreaking way possible, calling for his children who would never hear him. Scott's body was found the next day, still sitting on the slope, frozen. His family said this: Scott died doing what he loved. But we wish he'd loved us more. We wish he'd chosen to come home. Scott Fisher's death is the worst in Everest history, not because of how he died, but because of who he was. And because his final moments were spent calling for the children he'd never see again. What these deaths teach us. These are the 10 worst deaths in Mount Everest history. Hannelore Schmatz, frozen sitting up for 17 years. Shreya Shah Chlorfine, died on the phone with her husband, David Sharp. 40 people walked past him. Yasuko Namba, left for dead twice. Doug Hansen, Rob Hall died trying to save him. Francis Arsentiev begged, "Don't leave me," for hours. 16 Sherpas, buried alive in 90 seconds. Marco Littenecker, Agonized in a crevasse for 5 days, Chen Yunnan, abandoned by his own team, Scott Fisher, died calling for his children. What do these deaths teach us? First, Everest doesn't care who you are. Experienced climbers, guides, Sherpas, clients. The mountain kills indiscriminately. Second, most Everest deaths are slow, not instant, not painless. People die over hours, days, fully conscious. Third, abandonment is common, not because climbers are cruel, but because rescue is often impossible, and staying means dying too. Fourth, summit fever kills. Shreya, Doug, David. They all ignored warnings, pushed too far, and they paid with their lives. Fifth, Sherpas bear disproportionate risk. They die doing the most dangerous work, for the least pay, and their deaths are often forgotten. Sixth, families are destroyed. Every death on Everest leaves behind children, spouses, parents, people who spend the rest of their lives asking, was it worth it? And the answer for most is no. No summit is worth dying for. No achievement is worth destroying your family. But people keep climbing, keep dying, because Everest calls to something deep in the human spirit, the desire to push limits, to achieve the impossible, even when the cost is everything. These 10 deaths are a reminder that Everest is not a playground, it's a graveyard. That courage is not enough, strength is not enough, that the mountain takes and keeps taking, and that the worst way to die on Everest is not quickly, it's slowly, consciously, alone, knowing you're being abandoned, knowing your family will never understand why you chose this, knowing that your final moments will be spent in agony, calling for help that will never come. These are the worst deaths in Mount Everest history, and they will not be the last, because as long as people climb Everest, people will die, slowly, painfully, alone, and their stories will join this list, a monument to human ambition and human tragedy.